Thank you very much for being with us. We have a great treat today. This is where WAMC Public Radio joins with the New York State Writers Institute. I'm Joe Donahue, joining with my colleague Paul Grandal from the New York State Writers Institute, and we are talking to a great writer about a great book, and it's a wonderful thing to support independent booksellers, to support our friends at Northshire Bookstore, and to help them. And because it's a weird time to sell books. So what better thing to talk about than Greek god and goddesses? Madeline Miller's new novel recasts the goddess Circe, best known for turning men into pigs, in Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey, as a powerful feminist goddess. The book follows Circe's eternities-long life as she navigates the worlds of deities and mortals, finding humanity and power among gods and titans. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Madeline Miller to the program. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here, and I love Northshire books, so I'm very, very happy. And of course, I love the New York State Summer Writers Institute, so this is really a huge pleasure to be here.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here. Give us a sense. The book just came out in paperback, so congratulations. What's great, for people who may not know this, what's great is the hardcover came out 2 years ago, which means when it takes that long for a book to come out in paperback, you did really well.
I feel very lucky.
So things went really well. So what was it about the subject that lured you in initially, and then what do you think it was that caught people, that interested people about something that, let's face it, when kids are assigned to read the Odyssey, the eyes roll back in the head, so oh god. Here we go.
Well, I have loved Greek mythology since I was a child, but I remember being very frustrated oftentimes by the portraits of the female characters in particular. Oftentimes the female characters don't even get a real character. They're just sort of names. They're in the background. Sometimes if, their story is really exciting, they might get to die in it to motivate the male hero. But for the most part, we're not really doing a deep dive into women's stories or women's lives. And so one of the characters that I felt like had been most neglected and that I was most frustrated that there wasn't more about her was this goddess Circe. She's the first witch in what gets called Western literature, and she infamously turns Odysseus's men into pigs in the Odyssey. And it seemed to me like there should just be a lot more about her. And so I really wanted to tell the story of this character I had been fascinated with. Why does one start turning men into pigs? How do you get that kind of power? All these questions that Homer doesn't really answer for us in the Odyssey, but I feel like are right there waiting to be answered. And one of the things, I'm a former high school Latin teacher, and so I know that look of glazing over very well that you were just talking about. But one of the things that I found in my teaching is that actually, if you just tell these ancient stories, children and grown-ups both really make the connection that, technology has changed and culture has changed, but we humans have not changed. And, the parallels between ancient times and modern times are sometimes so resonant and so fresh that it's almost shocking. And so in writing Circe, I didn't feel like I had to, wrench it into the modern world and make all these changes and add all these things for a modern audience. I felt like it was all there in her story. This is a story of a woman finding her power and finding her place in the world that is, in a society that is very hostile to her having that place and that power.
And that speaks to the resonance, doesn't it? Because it comes at a time where we're having this conversation about just that.
Yes, exactly. And, what I kind of wanted to do is take a woman's story and set it at the center of an epic adventure. And I think women's lives have always been full of epic adventure, but it hasn't always made the great epic poems. So this was sort of my attempt to give, a woman's life the same treatment that Achilles and Odysseus and Ajax have had for centuries.
Right. Let me ask, with the paperback edition, do you actually go in and was there like a couple typos that just aggravated you? Because I've never heard of any book that has no typos or perfect. Do you make any changes in the paperback? And then I saw that HBO Max had optioned it and was going to turn it into a series. Can you talk where that's at? And or is there going to be a tie-in with this paperback and the series and things?
So I did catch I think one typo and one line that I wanted to clarify just to make something really crystal clear. I am really an absolutely maniacal editor. So I read and reread and reread and force my poor husband, who's also an editor, to read it multiple times. So I try and do my best with typos, but I agree, they always kind of sneak in. The main thing that I changed is that I added some things to the acknowledgments, and I'm always really glad for the chance to do that, because by the time, when you turn in the acknowledgments versus when the book comes out, there have been all these other people who have come out of the woodwork to help you and help the book find its way. So for the paperback, I got to add in some extra thank yous, which was really nice.
Great. And how about the series?
Oh yes, HBO Max. So right now it's still in development. I don't have much involvement in that. I sort of get little whispers of what's happening. I don't know anything about adapting any books for the screen, including my own. So I am very glad to leave it in the hands of the professionals, and I'm sort of excited to see what's going to happen. So right now they're in the writing process, and I'm hopeful that will just keep going. And yeah, but there's no imminent release date, and I think everything right now is on hold anyway, all the filming and that kind of stuff. So but the writer's room, the good news is that the writer's room and the writing that's being done on it can all happen virtually. So it's still going forward, which is great.
Great.
Are you involved in that process? The great mystery writer Robert B. Parker once told me that the best advice he had for any author who is selling their work is to just take the money and run. Are and he said that after being involved in a show. Is that something you wanted to be involved in, or just say, okay, let's see what you can do with it?
I was completely content to let them run with it, because I feel like it's a world that I really don't understand and don't know how to work with. Now, if you were going to ask me about how I would feel if, for example, Circe was going to be a stage play, I would be a lot more controlling, because I have a background in theater. I've done a lot of adaptation of works to the stage, and I feel like I do know something about that. Maybe I know just enough to make me dangerous. So, I would want to at that.
But the way that works is it has to become a successful movie before they'll make it a stage play based on the book.
Yes.
If that makes any sense.
Yes, no, it does. My wish for the stage would actually be my first novel, which is The Song of Achilles.
Yeah.
I have always seen that as being very much an easy transition to the stage. So that would be more what I would be thinking of.
And I love that novel. Do you think the transition becomes because there is a simplicity, so an incredible depth to the story, and something that, to me, really good theater should just be completely wrenching.
Yes. And, I think that the intimacy of the story would translate really well to theater, because there is something so incredibly powerful about sitting in the same room, breathing the same air with these actors who are telling this story so passionately right in front of you. So I think the intimacy would translate. And I also think that sometimes, an adaptation of the Iliad, where there's this huge war component, sometimes it can get lost in the battle scenes. And I think on the stage, you're really forced to kind of keep those battle scenes contained. You can't go all out on the CGI. And so therefore the focus stays on Achilles and Patroclus, on the love story, which is, in my novel, where the focus should be.
Right. I was wondering, I saw in your bio you had done some study and some work as a dramaturg. Does that help you with the structure of a novel? Because I know that's really, pulling apart the structure of a drama, but does that help in your novel writing?
Well, here's where I have to confess that I am not very structured about my my novel thinking. And as a former high school teacher, I always feel embarrassed to admit that I don't outline at all. But I think that dramaturgy really helped me think about help me know how to research and sort of what are the pieces of research that I need in order to make this story feel really vivid. And so dramaturgy really supported the way I approach immersing myself in a story. So with Circe, there are a lot of sort of small details that I have actually done. There's a ton of research behind it. I think it was Ernest Hemingway who talked about the amount of research should be like a glacier. You know, you just see the little top, but there's this huge amount underneath that you need. And so that's very much my approach. And all the little sort of objects that occur in Circe, the daggers, the cups, the jewels, most of those are based on actual archaeological finds that we have. So I'm always trying to make the world feel as vivid and real as possible, and that's sort of where my dramaturgy and academic background come in.
And I'll do one more follow-up, Joe. I'm sorry.
No, not at all.
I'm wondering about that research. I've talked to other historical novelists feel like they get paralyzed. They just do so much, and it just kind of kills the creative and their freedom to write. I'm wondering how much research you do. You try to go on site and walk in the steps of the Odyssey and things. You try to go to ancient Greece and
Absolutely. And I think that's the part that, you really, for me, I really have to be there. So I've been to Troy, and I've been all over Greece, and there's a lot of debate about where Aiaia was, which is Circe's magical island. I think it was just a magical island and wasn't really anywhere, but the ancients put it in a bunch of different places, including the Black Sea, over near Rome. And so I went to all those places, and my Aiaia is kind of, 25% Greek island, 25% Black Sea, 25% Amalfi Coast, and 25% just magic and imagination. But all those places went into informing it. And there is truly nothing like being able to stand there and smell the air and feel the quality of the dust and look at the way the light hits the ocean. I mean, that is the type of stuff that you cannot get from a book. You have to see it yourself.
Excellent.
You spoke a moment ago about that this is the story of a woman finding her power, and I'm curious as to, given that really unable to say what she thinks, but then that obviously changes at the end of the book, of then that journey, and then fitting all of that into the real stuff, and into the history, into all of the research that you did, and is that ever a conflict of getting that all the way you want it to be, and yet to be true to what you know?
I mean, I think that's a great question. And one of the things that I'm always aware of as someone with a background in classics is that looking at all this material that we have about the classical world is actually only looking through the very smallest kind of pinhole to see the classical world. All of the sources that we have from sort of the literary side of things, with very, very few exceptions, obviously Sappho is an exception, are male writers and aristocratic writers. So we're dealing with this very small portion of society that is giving us all these voices that we've been drawing on and talking back to for 3,000 years. So part of what I sort of feel like that gives me is this license to imagine my way into the fact of how would other people tell this story. This is the way the male heroic tradition has told the story, but there were all these other voices in the ancient world, even if we can't really hear them. So I sort of feel invited to do that. And with Circe's episode in particular, because actually Circe's episode in the Odyssey is told by Odysseus himself. Odysseus, the great liar of ancient literature, the great self-aggrandizer. And so once you kind of think about the Circe episode from the perspective of this is Odysseus telling the story to some people he wants to impress, it starts to look like, oh, okay, I get it, Odysseus. There was this terrifying witch and she got the jump on your men, but then you tamed her and she threw herself at you and she was very hot. You know, that I feel like all of a sudden we start to see that Odysseus has a real agenda in the way he's shaping this episode. And, you know, that there is all this sort of negative space on the other side of the image that is just completely unwritten. That is her story and how she would see it.
Well, but that's interesting too, because she really comes off very well in this story, just by contrast to these gods who are horrendously horrible, right? I mean, there's just that, and the fact that Circe is a caregiver.
Yes. And, you know, that was something that really drew me to her from the beginning. And it was something that I was getting right out of the research and right out of the ancient sources, which is that as a witch, her power is really distinct from divine power. Divine power is the sort of Shazam type of power. It's you think it and it's done. Whereas witchcraft is what I consider an art. It comes out of knowledge of working with herbs. It comes out of dedication, trial and error, passion, skill. It's something that you do, not something that you're born. And so I was really drawn to the fact that her power was so different from the power of most gods, because it's this power that she has developed herself. It's her craft, it's her art. And so I saw Circe's story as really the story of an artist, as you know, as well as everything else. And so that detail was coming right out of how the ancients thought about witchcraft. And then the other detail that I was using from Homer is Homer has this throwaway description of Circe as the dread goddess who speaks like a human. And so even the fact that she is caught between sort of the world of the gods and the world of mortals was something that I was sort of teasing out. So I feel a little bit like a magpie. I go through all the ancient sources, and then I pick out the details that really resonate with me, and I sort of let them germinate and let them grow and take on psychological weight and psychological depth. But I'm always rooted in the sources.
So why was she turning men into pigs? I mean, because Homer never says why, right?
That's right. Homer never says. And you know, what I was thinking about, I was thinking a lot of things about this, because sometimes people ask me, you know, is this where it comes from, the whole men are pigs? No men here, of course. But, you know, men are pigs, and because pigs are bad and men are bad, sort of, is this where that cycle comes from? And the answer is no. That actually the way the ancients looked on pigs is really different from the way we have come to think of them today, which is very influenced by the Judeo-Christian tradition of pigs as unclean animals. And that the ancients saw pigs much more as holy animals, sacrificial animals, animals that were associated with goddesses in particular. And so what Circe is doing to those men in that moment is actually a very mysterious thing. Yes, on one hand, she's turning them into beasts, and that is, you know, clearly dehumanizing, and it's a very negative thing, but there's a lot more depth to it than just they're bad, and so she's showing their inner badness. There's a lot more to it, and I really wanted to allow that sort of ambiguity to be there. In some sense, I think my Circe identifies with pigs. She sees them as survivors. So I wanted it to be sort of this mysterious thing that came out of her unconscious that she does. But as for why she does it, you know, speaking of kind of connecting the mythology with the real, one of the things that the mythology tells us is that here she is on an island by herself with no man there. And any woman who was alone without a man to protect her, either a husband or a brother or a father, would immediately have been seen as a target. And so I was sort of connecting what we know from mythology to what the real world experience of women in the ancient world would have been. And, Circe is actually in a very dangerous situation. And so to me, turning someone into pigs is a pretty extreme thing to do. And I imagine that it must have been a pretty extreme thing that provoked her doing that.
Let me ask, your protagonist, a female in Circe or a male in Achilles, as a novelist, does it feel like it's a harder bar or harder task to write about a male character, or no difference to you? Or
I never try and write for huge groups of people. Whenever I'm trying to get in the head of a narrator, I'm just trying to be an expert on that one person. And in some sense, I think I found Patroclus's voice easier to write than Circe's, because with Circe, I was trying to write from a goddess's perspective. And I was trying to write from someone who had experienced time in a completely different way from the way I've ever experienced time, who has lived for centuries, who has seen absolutely fantastical things. And so getting that sort of, I wanted her voice to reflect that sort of strange passing of time, that sometimes time seems to go very quickly for her and sometimes it goes much more slowly, and that she has this sort of interesting relationship to time. And so that was actually the hardest thing in the voice of either of them.
Right. Just a follow-up on a personal note. I know you have 2 young children. How do you balance being a mother, especially in this quarantine, trying to write, with kids running around? And can you talk about the chair incident before we came on? The challenges of being a mother and a writer,
One of the great excuses. Paul and I have done a lot of interviews. It's one of the great excuses.
I also want to see this show up in a future story or novel.
Yeah.
It may very well show up in a future story. So I'm going to give you the behind the scenes. Yeah, so it's incredibly challenging to have, 2 incredibly energetic young children shut up in a house without their friends or their grandparents or any of their usual outlets. And I was actually they're being incredibly gracious. I was a little bit late for this interview because my daughter had a mishap with the rocking chair and gotten her leg caught between the slats of the rocking chair. It was horrifying. It was one of the most stressful moments. We couldn't get it out. We didn't know what we needed to do. Eventually we got some grease going on and we were able to get it out, but it was incredibly stressful. And of course, she's crying, her older sister is crying. It's just complete chaos. Our stress levels are going through the roof. So that is the most extreme example of the ways that it can be challenging during this time. But, I'm trying to just embrace it all. I think we're at a moment where we are all showing our seams a little bit more. And in some ways, I think that's a good thing. Let's let all those human seams show.
Right. Have you found the time? Are you already working on a new novel, or is this a kind of a pause moment in your writing?
I am working on a new novel. And actually this goes back to something that you were saying before, which is my new novel is inspired by Shakespeare's Tempest. This is
there you go.
The theater side of me coming out.
Yeah.
And what I love about it is actually how not historical it is. And in some way, I think that gives me a lot of freedom. Just like writing Circe in the Song of Achilles, I wasn't actually taking, Mycenaean, Minoan, Bronze Age Greece as my background. I was taking Homer as my background. And Homer is this mix of time periods and it's oral tradition and it's fantastical. And same thing with the Tempest, that Shakespeare's grasp of Italian history is real shaky. And so, you can't really match the Tempest up, even though there's all this talk about kind of political maneuvering with Milan and with Naples. You can't actually fully match that up to any real historical time period. So I sort of like working in that intersection between the historical period and the literary world. And there's some really fun slippage there that I think as a writer you can use and exploit and be inspired by. So I love writing in another writer's world.
That's great. Perhaps Caliban will get his leg caught in a chair. I don't know how you can.
That is kind of a Calibanic move, I think.
Go ahead.
But he's so different from much of Shakespeare, right? I mean, Caliban really stands out and is a really an interesting character, and something I would think that would be fascinating to explore.
Yes, I completely agree. I think Caliban is one of the most extraordinary creations, and he really stands alone, and his language is so interesting, and he's sort of, oftentimes he's treated very comically, that he's this foolish character. He gets drunk over the course of the play, but yet he is, in his own life, in his own head, he is very clearly in a tragedy. And I think that, you know, he is struggling with some really intense stuff and expressing himself so intensely. I absolutely love his character. So it has been really a pleasure to just live inside the words of his character.
Once you're in Shakespeare, do you think you can ever leave that world? I mean, just sort of ripe, right? I mean, you could just, there's your career.
They're right. Well, actually, this is going to sound kind of funny, but The Tempest is the only play that right now I can imagine myself writing about. Partially because I have trouble seeing beyond, you know, whatever project is in front of me, but also because any other play of Shakespeare, I would just want to direct. But I was finding The Tempest so incredibly frustrating to direct that I finally realized that what I wanted to say about The Tempest could not be directed into it. I was just going to have to write a novel about it to say what I wanted to say.
How do you feel about modernization of bringing Shakespeare, of making it contemporary, of how you present the story?
You know, I think it's like any other type of production. It can be done well, or it can be done really terribly. One of the most sort of interesting and vivid and memorable Shakespeare productions I ever saw was by a Philadelphia theater company called Pig Iron. It was Measure for Measure, and it was set in a morgue, in a modern day morgue, where most of the characters were corpses. And that I can't even describe. I mean, I went to it as like, well, this is going to be really weird. And it was really weird. But what was amazing is it was incredibly moving and affecting, and it worked. And I would never, ever have guessed that it could work. But at the same time, I think a lot of times people will try to modernize Shakespeare to sort of make the connection between, you know, Shakespeare's time and the things that Shakespeare's dealing with in now. And I don't think you need to do that. I think that it's all in the Shakespeare. If you just tell the story well, those resonances, it's like ancient Greek myth, they're going to pop out. They're going to be right there if you really tell the story. So I think I would urge, as a dramaturg, I would urge a director to really make sure that they're doing it for a good reason and not for the gimmick of it.
Oh, I love that idea. Did you see Glenda Jackson and King Lear?
No, I didn't, but wow, that sounds interesting.
Well, it was a mess, but for all the reasons you just mentioned. But she's amazing. She's a force, absolutely incredible, and King Lear, for God's sakes, it's just amazing. But they put her in sort of this Trumpian palace, and there was a modernization to it that just didn't work, and it just seemed squandered of how lovely it could have been had it been, you know, true to the original, obviously.
Yeah,
but,
well, I that's always so disappointing when you see a production that has so much star power, so much talent, and it just doesn't hit it. So I'm sorry to hear that.
Do you actually have time to direct live theater now in your busy life, and teaching as well? Are you doing any teaching currently here?
No, sadly, both teaching and theater have had to kind of go by the wayside. I still do some tutoring, but between writing and doing some visiting of sort of universities and schools to talk about myth and writing, and then having two kids, that's full for me. So I'm hoping that down the line, I'll kind of get to cycle those back in again, because I certainly miss them, but I don't want to be doing them. I don't want to be doing everything sort of half. I want to be doing something whole.
Well, and out of the three, you picked the one that pays best. So good for you.
I don't know how well childcare pays.
No, not childcare.
You pick great locales too, you know, Greek islands or magical island. You're not going into like the desert or some, you know, war-torn place. You're picking beautiful locales to go research. Very smart.
It was, I have to say that trip down the Amalfi Coast was a real trial for me. It was really just exhausting.
Somebody's got to do it.
And if you can ever get on a plane again, it'll be lovely. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us. What a great pleasure to speak with you. Circe is out in paperback now. It's out in the world, both in hardcover and paperback. And congratulations. Thank you so much for being with us. What a great pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This is really a treat.
And give our best to your daughter and her leg.
Thank you. Thank you.
You are cool under pressure. Thank you. All right. Thanks a lot.
Oh, this was such a pleasure, really. Thank you both for being so gracious. And again, I'm so sorry to have kept you waiting. That was really...
It was fine. It was really, we got a chance to catch up, and it was lovely. So thank you very much.
Well, I thank you also for putting up with me being extremely frazzled at the beginning of this.
And just finally, we really want to support our independent bookstores. The whole point of this is to assist, particularly with Circe Northshire Bookstore, that you and Joe were going to have an in-store event, and hopefully this can help them a little bit, because they need our help, and hopefully people will buy some books.
I really hope so. Northshire is amazing, and I'm so grateful for all you're doing for my work and for them and for writers and readers.